The leather wallet hit the marble floor with a soft thud that nobody seemed to notice. And for Marcus Chen, that sound was the beginning of everything. He didn't bend down to pick it up. He didn't even glance back. He simply kept walking toward the elevator, his $1,000 shoes clicking against the polished stone. His jaw set in that familiar line of disappointment that had become his default expression over the past 3 years. Behind him, in the shadow of a potted palm near the fountain, a woman in a gray uniform paused mid-motion, her cleaning cart frozen beside her, her dark eyes fixed on the black object that lay there like a test she hadn't asked to take. Before we go any further into what happened next, I need to ask you something. If you believe in stories that remind us why integrity still matters, why one choice can echo through an entire life, then please hit that subscribe button right now. This channel exists because people like you believe that goodness deserves to be witnessed and shared. Your subscription isn't just a click. It's a vote for the kind of world we want to build together, where the right choice, even when it costs us everything, still matters. So please, subscribe now, turn on notifications, and let's continue this story together. Because what happens next will break your heart before it heals it. The woman's name was Elena Reyes, though Marcus Chun wouldn't learn that for several more days. What he would learn, though he didn't know it yet as he stepped into that elevator, was that some people carry more weight in their silence than others carry in all their words combined. Elena stood there for what felt like an eternity but was probably only 10 seconds, staring at that wallet the way someone might stare at a door they knew they shouldn't open. The lobby of the Meridian Tower was nearly empty at this hour, past 8 in the evening, when most of the executives had already departed and only the night cleaning crews remained to erase the evidence of their existence. She could hear water running somewhere, another cleaner working the bathrooms on the second floor. She could hear the hum of the building's ventilation system, that low mechanical breathing that became white noise after enough hours. She could hear her own heartbeat, which seemed unreasonably loud. Elena had been cleaning offices for 6 years. Before that, she'd worked retail, and before that, she'd been 2 semesters into a nursing degree that evaporated when her mother's medical bills started arriving like dunning prophecies of everything she'd never become. She was 32 years old. She had calluses on her hands that no amount of lotion could soften. She had a daughter named Sophia who was 8 years old and needed new glasses that insurance wouldn't fully cover. She had a landlord who'd already granted her 2 extensions on rent and had made it clear, with words that were polite but immovable, that there would not be a third. She had exactly $43 in her checking account and payday was 6 days away, and somewhere in the back of her mind was the constant low-frequency hum of a calculator that never stopped running, that added and subtracted and always came up short. The wallet lay there like an accusation. Elena looked around the lobby, but there was no one. The security guard, Paul, was doing his rounds on the upper floors. The other cleaner was still out of sight. The cameras, she knew there were always cameras in buildings like this, were positioned near the elevators and entrances, focused on threats from outside, not on the sad small dramas that played out in the margins. She told herself she was going to pick up the wallet and take it to the security desk. That's what she told herself. That was the plan that formed in the reasonable part of her mind, the part that had been trained since childhood to do the right thing, to be honest, to return lost items to their owners. But she didn't move toward the security desk. Instead, she picked up the wallet with hands that trembled slightly, though she would have denied the trembling if anyone had asked, and she set it on her cleaning cart, beneath a folded towel, and she continued pushing that cart toward the service elevator as if nothing had happened. Her heart was doing something complicated in her chest, something that felt like it might be panic or might be possibility or might be the simple animal recognition that she just crossed a line she'd spent her whole life carefully staying behind. In the service elevator, alone with the fluorescent lights and the faint smell of disinfectant that had become as familiar as her own skin, Elena finally allowed herself to look at the wallet properly. It was made of leather so soft it felt obscene, the kind of leather that probably cost more than she made in a month. She opened it. Inside, she found $940 in cash. She counted it twice, her fingers moving automatically, her mind somewhere else entirely. There was also a black American Express Centurion card, the kind she'd only ever seen in movies, the kind that supposedly had no limit. There was a driver's license with the name Marcus Chen and an address in a neighborhood she'd cleaned houses in once, where every home looked like a museum and every car looked like it had just been polished. There was a photo, slightly faded, of a young Asian woman smiling at the camera with the kind of unself-conscious joy that looked like it belonged to a different century. And there was a business card for Chan Industries, with the title CEO and founder printed in elegant sans-serif letters. Elena closed the wallet and set it back on her cart, still beneath the towel. The elevator reached her floor. The doors opened. She stepped out and began her nightly routine, moving through empty offices, emptying trash cans, wiping down desks, vacuuming floors, performing the invisible labor that allowed other people to arrive in the morning and believe their spaces clean themselves. But her mind wasn't on the work. Her mind was doing math. $940. That was rent, with enough left over for Sophia's glasses and maybe, just maybe, a decent meal at a real restaurant instead of another week of pasta and canned sauce. That was breathing room. That was sleeping through the night without waking up at 3 a.m. to recalculate which bills could be delayed and which ones absolutely couldn't. She thought about Marcus Chen, whoever he was, and she found it remarkably easy to feel nothing. Men like that lost more money in couch cushions than she earned in a year. Men like that wouldn't even notice $940 missing. They probably spent that much on dinner. They probably tipped that much. The distance between her life and his was so vast that it seemed almost cosmically absurd that their paths had intersected at all, even in this tangential way, even through the medium of a dropped wallet. He didn't need the money. She did. That was just mathematics. That was just reality. But there was the photo. She kept thinking about the photo. The woman in it looked so happy. It looked like a personal thing, not the kind of photo you carried for show. It looked like the kind of photo you carried because you needed to remember something or someone, or some version of yourself that might otherwise get lost. And there was something about that photo that made Elena's chest feel tight, because it suggested that Marcus Chen, CEO and founder, man with the black card and the expensive leather, was also a person who missed someone. And people who missed someone were real in a way that made them harder to steal from. She finished her floor. She took her break in the small room where the cleaning supplies were stored, sitting on an overturned bucket, eating a granola bar that was supposed to be her dinner, staring at the wallet that she'd set on the shelf beside the bottles of glass cleaner. She had 30 minutes. That was the math of a different kind. In 30 minutes, she needed to decide whether she was the kind of person who returned wallets or the kind of person who didn't. She needed to decide whether her desperation was greater than her decency. She needed to decide whether Sophia would grow up with a mother who kept her promises or a mother who did what she had to do to survive, and whether there was even a difference between those two things anymore. Elena thought about her own mother, who'd cleaned houses until her knees gave out, who'd never taken anything that didn't belong to her. Not once, not even when things got so bad they were eating rice and beans for every meal. Her mother had died believing that goodness mattered, that integrity was its own reward, that God saw everything and would eventually balance the scales. Elena had been at her mother's bedside when she died, holding her hand, listening to her labored breathing, surrounded by medical equipment that her mother's lifetime of goodness had done absolutely nothing to pay for. The scales had not been balanced. God, if he existed, had not intervened. Goodness had mattered exactly as much as it always did, which was not at all. But even as Elena thought these thoughts, even as she built the case for why taking the money would be justified, even understandable, even morally defensible given the grotesque inequity of their situations, she knew with a certainty that felt like defeat that she wasn't going to keep it. She wasn't going to keep it because her mother's voice was still in her head, still speaking in that quiet way she'd had, saying that who you are is what you do when no one is watching. She wasn't going to keep it because Sophia asked her questions sometimes, questions about right and wrong, and Elena needed to be able to look at her daughter and believe that the answers she gave weren't lies. She wasn't going to keep it because something small and stubborn and possibly very stupid inside her still believed that the world should be a place where the right thing happened, even if it meant she suffered for it. The knowledge that she was going to return the wallet didn't make her feel good. It made her feel exhausted. It made her feel like she was failing some crucial survival test, like she was choosing to starve for the sake of principles that no one else seemed to follow. But she also knew that if she kept it, if she spent that money, she'd never be able to unhear the sound of her own justifications. She'd never be able to stop calculating the exact price of her dignity, and that seemed like a worse kind of poverty than the one she was already living in. Elena finished her break. She collected the wallet. She looked up the address on Marcus Chen's license using her phone, which was 4 years old and had a cracked screen and took forever to load web pages. The address was in Harbor Heights, which was on the other side of the city. She didn't have a car. She'd sold it 8 months ago when the transmission failed and the repair estimate came back at more than the car was worth. She could take the bus, but that would mean 3 transfers and probably 2 hours each way, and she needed to be home by 11 because the woman who watched Sophia charged by the hour and Elena was already pushing the limits of what she could afford. She could mail it, but that would cost money she didn't have, and there was also the reality that mail got lost, packages got stolen, and she needed to see this through with her own eyes, needed to know for certain that the wallet reached its owner. She decided to go to Harbor Heights tonight, after her shift. It was already past 9. If she rushed through the rest of her cleaning, she could catch the 10:15 bus and maybe, if everything went perfectly, be back by midnight. Sophia would be asleep. The babysitter would be annoyed but would survive. Elena would be exhausted tomorrow, but that was also nothing new. This is what returning the wallet would cost. Her time, her money for bus fare, her energy, her sleep. And she'd receive exactly nothing in return except the knowledge that she'd done it. She worked faster than she'd ever worked. She skipped entire offices that didn't look too bad. She was supposed to vacuum every floor, but she only did the ones that showed footprints. She was supposed to disinfect every surface, but she cut corners, she moved quickly. She did the minimum that would keep her from getting written up. By 10, she was clocking out. By 10:15, she was at the bus stop, wallet still hidden in her bag, standing under the flickering streetlight with a handful of other late-night travelers who all looked as tired as she felt. The bus arrived 12 minutes late. Elena sat by the window and watched the city slide past, the downtown towers giving way to residential neighborhoods, the residential neighborhoods giving way to the kind of streets where trees were planted in careful intervals and every lawn looked manicured. She'd cleaned houses in areas like this. She knew what the interiors looked like, knew about the marble countertops and the temperature-controlled wine cellars and the bathrooms that were bigger than her entire apartment. She knew that the people who lived here believed they'd earned it, believed their success was a direct result of their merit and their work, and she knew that they were probably right but also knew they'd never had to choose between food and electricity, never had to tell their child that new shoes would have to wait, never had to clean up after strangers for minimum wage while their own dreams accumulated dust in some forgotten corner of their minds. The bus ride took 90 minutes. She transferred twice. By the time she reached Harbor Heights, it was nearly midnight. The address on Marcus Chen's license led her to a building that was less a home and more a statement, all glass and steel and geometric precision, set back from the street behind a gate that probably cost more than most houses. There was an intercom system. Elena stood there, looking at it, aware that she was a woman in a cleaning uniform showing up at midnight at the home of a billionaire, aware of how this would look, aware of all the ways this could go wrong. She pressed the button. Nothing happened for long enough that she thought maybe the system was broken, or maybe he wasn't home, or maybe this whole journey had been wasted. Then a voice came through the speaker, male, tired sounding, with an edge of irritation. "Yes, Mr. Chen." Elena's voice came out smaller than she'd intended. "I have your wallet. You dropped it at the Meridian Tower." There was a pause. Then, "What?" "Your wallet," she repeated. "I'm a cleaner at the building. I found it. I'm returning it." Another pause, longer this time. Elena wondered if he was checking cameras, running some kind of security protocol, debating whether this was some elaborate scam. Then the gate began to open. "Come to the front door," he said. Elena walked up the curved driveway, past landscaping that looked like it required a team of gardeners, past a fountain that burbled quietly in the darkness, past 3 cars that were probably worth more than she'd earn in her lifetime. The front door opened before she reached it. Marcus Chen stood there, and he looked different than his driver's license photo. Older, more tired. His hair was slightly disheveled, like he'd been running his hands through it. He was wearing an expensive-looking shirt that wasn't tucked in. He looked at her the way people in his position looked at people in hers, with a kind of neutral assessment that wasn't quite suspicious but wasn't quite trusting either. "You brought my wallet," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." Elena reached into her bag and pulled it out. She held it out to him, and when he took it, their fingers didn't touch. He opened it immediately, and she watched him count the cash, watched him check for the cards, watched him pause when he saw the photo. Something changed in his expression, something small but unmistakable. He looked at her again, and this time the assessment was different. "You didn't take anything," he said. "No. You came all the way here. At midnight." "Yes." He seemed to be waiting for her to elaborate, to explain herself, to provide the story that would make this make sense. But Elena didn't offer one. She was too tired, and she'd already spent too much of herself getting here, and she didn't owe him her narrative. She'd done what she came to do. The wallet was returned. That was all. "Why?" he finally asked, and there was something in his voice that sounded almost vulnerable, almost confused, like this was a question that actually mattered to him. Elena looked at him, this man with his expensive house and his black card and his untouchable life, and she tried to find words for something that felt too simple to explain but also too complicated to reduce to a sentence. "Because it wasn't mine," she said finally. "That's all." They stood there for a moment in that doorway in the middle of the night, two people separated by almost everything except this one brief intersection of circumstance. Marcus Chin looked like he wanted to say something else. He looked like he was struggling with something. Then he reached for his wallet, pulled out several bills, held them out to her. "For your trouble," he said. Elena looked at the money. It was probably $500. It was more than she'd make in a week. It was enough to solve half her problems and provide breathing room for the rest. And the sight of it made her feel something she hadn't expected to feel, which was insulted. She'd spent 4 hours and the last of her energy to return his wallet not because she wanted a reward but because it was the right thing to do, and now he was turning that choice into a transaction, into something that could be paid for and dismissed and forgotten. "I don't want your money," she said quietly. "You came all this way. You should take it. I didn't come for a reward. I came because I found something that belonged to you and I returned it. That's all." She took a step back from the door. "Good night, Mr. Chun." She turned to leave, and she was halfway down the driveway when she heard him call out, "Wait!" She stopped but didn't turn around. She heard his footsteps approaching. "What's your name?" "Elena. Elena Reyes." "Thank you, Elena Reyes. Really. Thank you." She nodded without turning, and then she walked back down the driveway, through the gate, out to the street where she'd wait for the bus that would take her back across the city to her small apartment and her sleeping daughter and the life she'd chosen not to compromise, even when compromise would have been so much easier. The bus ride back felt longer. Elena sat in the same seat by the window, watching the wealthy neighborhoods give way to middle-class streets, then working-class blocks, then finally the area she called home, where the buildings were older and the streetlights sometimes didn't work and you learned to walk quickly after dark. She got home at 2 in the morning. The babysitter, a college student from down the hall named Maria, was asleep on the couch. Elena woke her gently, paid her the last of the cash she'd had in her wallet. Not the wallet she'd returned but her own, which was falling apart and held nothing valuable, and locked the door behind her. Sophia was asleep in the bedroom they shared, curled up with the stuffed elephant that had been her favorite since she was 3. Elena stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her daughter breathe, watching the way her small chest rose and fell, and she felt the full weight of what she'd done finally settle onto her shoulders. She'd returned the wallet. She'd done the right thing, and she was still exactly as broke as she'd been before. Nothing had changed except that she'd lost 4 hours of sleep and she'd have to wake up in 5 hours to get Sophia ready for school before going to her own job. The right choice hadn't made anything easier. It hadn't solved anything. It had only cost her more than she could afford. But when she finally lay down on the couch that served as her bed, when she closed her eyes against the exhaustion that felt like it might swallow her whole, Elena found that she could breathe a little easier than she had in months. She'd been tested and she hadn't failed. She'd been offered an easy way out, and she hadn't taken it. She was still poor, still struggling, still drowning in bills and responsibilities and the weight of all the things she couldn't provide for her daughter. But she wasn't a thief. She wasn't someone who took what didn't belong to her. She was still the person her mother had raised her to be, and in a world that seemed designed to punish that kind of integrity, that felt like a small victory worth claiming. What Elena couldn't know, was that Marcus Chun wasn't sleeping either. He was sitting in his study, A room lined with books he'd collected but rarely read, holding his wallet, looking at the photo of his ex-wife that he'd kept for reasons he'd stopped trying to understand. Her name had been Rachel. They'd been married for 6 years. She'd been his partner at Chun Industries from the beginning, had been there when it was just the two of them working 18-hour days in a rented office, had been there for every success and every failure. And then one day he'd discovered that she'd been stealing from the company for almost a year. Not a lot at first. Small amounts that wouldn't be noticed. But it had grown, gotten bolder, until she was siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars into offshore accounts. When he confronted her, she hadn't even seemed sorry. She'd said he'd become obsessed with the business, that she'd felt neglected, that she deserved compensation for everything she'd sacrificed. She turned his love into a rationalization for betrayal, and something in him had broken that day that had never quite healed. Since then, Marcus had become someone else. He'd become harder, more suspicious, less trusting. He'd fired employees for minor infractions. He'd ended friendships over perceived slights. He'd built walls around himself and convinced himself those walls were wisdom, that his cynicism was just clear-sightedness, that trust was for fools who hadn't learned yet how the world really worked. He'd tested people constantly, looking for the moment they'd reveal their true nature, looking for proof that everyone eventually would choose themselves over principle. And he'd found that proof over and over, until his suspicion felt justified, until his isolation felt earned. The wallet had been another test. He'd dropped it deliberately, though he'd told himself at the time that it was accidental. He'd wanted to see what would happen. He'd wanted to watch the person who found it, wanted to see how long it would take before they opened it, before they saw the cash and the cards and made their choice. He'd planned to review the security footage the next day, had planned to have his assistant track down whoever took it and confront them, had planned to add one more data point to his growing mountain of evidence that people were fundamentally selfish and that his cynicism was justified. But Elena Reyes had returned it. She'd traveled across the city at midnight. She'd refused a reward. And now Marcus was sitting in his study at 2 a.m, realizing that his test had backfired in the most unexpected way possible. He'd been trying to prove that people couldn't be trusted, and instead he'd encountered someone who'd proven the opposite. And he didn't know what to do with that information. It didn't fit into his framework. It challenged everything he'd built his worldview on for the past 3 years. He thought about calling his head of security, a former FBI agent named Patricia who handled all the background checks and investigations for the company. He wanted to know who Elena Reyes was. He wanted to know her story, her history, her circumstances. He wanted to understand what would make someone in her position, and he could tell from her uniform, from the way she carried herself, that she wasn't wealthy, choose to return $940 when she could have easily kept it. But even as he reached for his phone, Marcus hesitated. There was something invasive about investigating her, something that felt like it would violate the strange and unexpected gift she'd given him. She'd done something kind without wanting anything in return. The least he could do was respect her privacy. But respect was complicated by curiosity, and curiosity was complicated by the realization that he'd been wrong about something fundamental, and being wrong was something Marcus Chen had not allowed himself to be for a very long time. He thought about the way Elena had looked at the money he'd offered her, the way she'd said, "I don't want your money," with a quiet dignity that had felt almost like a rebuke. He tried to pay her off, to reduce her integrity to a transaction he could complete and forget about, and she'd refused. She'd refused because she understood something he'd forgotten. That not everything could be bought, that some actions had value precisely because they couldn't be compensated for, that the moment you tried to put a price on decency you destroyed the thing that made it valuable. Marcus set the wallet on his desk and stared at it like it was an artifact from a civilization he no longer understood. He'd built an empire. He was worth more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes. He had influence and power and the kind of success that people wrote articles about. And a woman who cleaned offices for minimum wage had just taught him something about integrity that all his achievements had never revealed. The irony felt heavy enough to make him laugh, except he'd forgotten how. 3 days passed. Marcus tried to focus on work, but he kept thinking about Elena. He kept wondering whether she'd made it home safely that night, whether the bus fare had been expensive, whether returning the wallet had created problems for her that he hadn't considered. The thought that his test might have actually harmed her was unbearable in a way that surprised him. On the fourth day, he couldn't stand it anymore. He called Patricia. "I need you to find someone," he said. "Her name is Elena Reyes. She works as a cleaner at the Meridian Tower. I need to know her situation." Patricia was efficient. By the next morning, Marcus had a file on his desk. Elena Reyes, 32 years old, single mother, worked for Apex Cleaning Services on the night shift. Daughter named Sophia, 8 years old, attended public school. Previous job history included retail and an incomplete nursing degree from 7 years ago. Current address in a low-income neighborhood. No criminal record. No debts beyond standard cost of living expenses, though the file noted several late payments on rent and utility bills. The financial section of the report made Marcus's chest feel tight. She was surviving on poverty wages while cleaning up after people who made more in a day than she made in a year. And she'd still returned his wallet. Marcus closed the file and sat in his office, staring out the window at the city below, thinking about inequality and choice and what it meant that the person who'd shown him the most integrity in years was someone the system had decided wasn't worth paying a living wage. He thought about the fact that Elena was probably at work right now, probably emptying his trash can, probably vacuuming his floor, moving through his building like a ghost that no one acknowledged. The thought made him feel complicit in something he'd never examined before, some vast machinery of indifference that allowed him to profit from the labor of people he never saw or thought about. He wanted to help her. The urge was strong and immediate and came from a place he'd thought had atrophied years ago. But he also knew that just showing up with a check would be wrong. Elena had refused his money once already. She'd made it clear that she hadn't returned the wallet for a reward. If he tried to pay her now, it would feel like he was trying to settle a debt, to buy his way out of the uncomfortable feeling her kindness had created. And that would reduce her choice to a transaction again, would make it about him and his comfort rather than about her and her agency. Marcus spent days thinking about what he could do that would actually help rather than just satisfy his own conscience. He couldn't offer her money directly, but he could offer opportunity. He could offer a path forward that would respect her autonomy while also acknowledging that she deserved better than the situation she was in. The question was how to do that without making it seem like charity, without making her feel like she owed him something, without destroying the very dignity she demonstrated when she refused his initial offer. He had an idea. It took him another week to set it up, working with his human resources department with the company's educational partnership program, with lawyers to make sure everything was structured properly. And then, on a Tuesday evening, he went to the Meridian Tower. He'd never been there this late before. The building had a different quality at night, quieter, emptier. The lights dimmed in the hallways. He found Elena on the 14th floor, pushing her cart between offices. When she saw him, she stopped. Her expression was careful, guarded, like she was trying to determine whether this encounter was going to be a problem. "Mr. Chun," she said, "is everything all right? I wanted to talk to you," he said. "Do you have a moment?" Elena glanced at her cart, at the offices she still had to clean, calculating whether she could afford the time. "I'm working," she said. "I know. I'm sorry to interrupt. This won't take long." He gestured to a small conference room nearby. "Could we sit?" She followed him into the conference room with obvious reluctance. They sat across from each other at a table that could seat 12, in chairs that probably cost more than her monthly rent. The fluorescent lights hummed above them. Marcus realized he didn't know how to start this conversation. Didn't know how to offer help to someone who'd already made it clear she didn't want to be in his debt. "I looked into your background," he said finally. "I know that probably seems invasive and I apologize, but I needed to understand your situation." Elena's expression hardened. "Why?" "Because you did something remarkable. Because you made a choice that most people wouldn't have made, and I wanted to understand why. I returned your wallet. That's not remarkable. That's basic decency. In my experience, basic decency is rare." Marcus leaned forward slightly. "I know you were studying to be a nurse. I know you didn't finish your degree. That's not your business. You're right. It's not. But I want to offer you something, and I need you to hear me out before you decide whether to be offended." He pulled a folder from his briefcase and slid it across the table. Chun Industries has a continuing education program. We sponsor employees who want to complete their degrees. Full tuition, flexible hours, childcare assistance if needed. We have partnerships with several universities in the area, including the one where you were enrolled. Elena looked at the folder but didn't touch it. I'm not an employee of Chun Industries. You could be. We're always looking for people in facilities management. The pay is better than what you're making now. The hours are more flexible. And if you wanted to finish your nursing degree, we'd support that. Why? Elena's voice was sharp now, edged with suspicion. Why would you do this? Because you deserve better than what you have. Because the system is broken and I benefit from that broken system, and maybe I can't fix it, but I can at least try to help one person who shouldn't have been crushed by it in the first place. I didn't return your wallet, so you'd give me a job. I know that. That's exactly why I want to offer you this opportunity. Marcus held her gaze. Elena, I'm not trying to pay you for what you did. I'm not trying to turn your integrity into a transaction. I'm trying to offer you something you should have had all along. A chance. What you do with that chance is up to you. Elena finally picked up the folder. She opened it and read through the pages slowly, carefully, like she was looking for the trap. Marcus waited. He could see her mind working, could see her trying to determine whether this was legitimate or whether there was some catch she wasn't seeing. Finally, she looked up at him. If I take this job, if I use this program, I don't owe you anything beyond doing the work well. This isn't a favor. This is an opportunity that I'd have to earn. Is that understood? Completely understood. And if I decide I don't want it, you're not going to make things difficult for me here? You have my word. She closed the folder and set it on the table between them. I need to think about it. Take all the time you need. The offer isn't going anywhere. Marcus stood up. I meant what I said the other night. Thank you. What you did mattered more than you know. He left the conference room and walked back to the elevator, aware that Elena was watching him go, aware that he'd just done something that felt both entirely right and somehow insufficient. He'd offered her an opportunity which was more respectful than offering her money, but it still felt tangled up with his own need to balance some internal equation, to prove to himself that he could still recognize goodness when he saw it. He didn't know whether she'd take the job. He suspected she was proud enough to refuse it just on principle. And that would be her right. He'd made the offer. The choice was hers. Elena sat in the conference room for a long time after Marcus left. She read through the folder 3 times, checking every detail, looking for the hidden costs, the unstated expectations, the ways this could turn into something she didn't want. But the offer seemed genuine. Better pay, better hours, educational support, benefits that actually covered things. It was the kind of opportunity she'd stopped believing existed for people like her. And that was almost more frightening than the alternative, because if she took it, if she let herself hope that things could actually get better, she'd have so much further to fall if it didn't work out. She thought about Sophia, who needed glasses and deserved a mother who wasn't constantly exhausted, who could afford to buy books instead of relying on the library, who could live in a place that didn't require triple-checking the locks at night. She thought about her abandoned nursing degree, about how she'd felt in those classes, how it had seemed like maybe she was building towards something before everything collapsed. She thought about what it would mean to try again, to return to school, to imagine a future that wasn't just an endless repetition of the present. She thought about Marcus Chen, about the way he'd looked at her in that doorway at midnight, about the money he tried to give her that she'd refused. She thought about the fact that he'd investigated her, which should have felt invasive but somehow felt like attention, like someone had actually seen her instead of looking through her the way most people in his position did. She thought about whether this was pity or guilt or genuine respect for what she'd done. She thought about whether it mattered. Finally, she put the folder in her bag and finished her shift. She went home. She paid the babysitter. She checked on Sophia, who was sleeping with her face pressed against the stuffed elephant, one arm thrown across the pillow. Elena sat on her couch bed in the dark and tried to imagine what it would be like to say yes to this opportunity, to allow herself to believe that returning that wallet had somehow opened a door she thought was permanently locked. The fear was real, but so was the possibility, and she was tired of being afraid. The next day, Elena called the number on the folder. A week later, she had an interview. 2 weeks after that, she started her new job in facilities management at Chun Industries. The pay was nearly double what she'd been making. The hours meant she could pick up Sophia from school most days. The childcare assistants covered after-school programs. And when she enrolled in night classes to finish her nursing degree, the company paid her tuition in full. Marcus didn't make a show of welcoming her. He didn't seek her out or make speeches about second chances. He simply made sure the resources were available, made sure the program worked the way it was supposed to, and then stepped back. Elena appreciated that more than he could have known. It allowed her to feel like she was earning her position rather than occupying some special category created by guilt or charity. She worked hard. She showed up early. She learned the systems and proved herself capable. And slowly, over months, she began to believe that maybe this was real, that maybe the universe didn't always punish people for doing the right thing, that maybe sometimes goodness actually did create ripples that came back around. They didn't become friends immediately. They barely spoke for the first few months. Elena was busy with work and school and Sophia. Marcus was busy running his company and trying to figure out who he wanted to be now that someone had challenged his carefully constructed cynicism. But they'd see each other occasionally in the halls or in the elevator, and they'd nod, and there was a recognition between them that felt significant even in its brevity. They were connected by what had happened that night, by the test and its unexpected outcome, by the way a simple choice about a wallet had become something neither of them could quite name but both of them understood mattered. 6 months after Elena started at Chun Industries, Marcus found himself in the cafeteria late one afternoon, getting coffee before a meeting. Elena was there too, sitting at a table with textbooks spread around her, highlighting notes with an intensity that reminded him of himself when he'd been building the company, that same focused determination to master material that seemed overwhelming. He got his coffee. He hesitated. Then he walked over to her table. "May I sit?" he asked. Elena looked up, surprised. "It's your company." "That's not an answer." She smiled slightly. "Yes, you can sit." He sat down across from her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then Elena said, "Thank you for the opportunity. I don't think I said that properly before. You don't need to thank me. You earned it." Still, she closed her textbook. "This has changed everything for us. For me and Sophia. I know you said it's not about the wallet, but I also know it is, at least partly. So thank you." Marcus looked at her, at this woman who'd traveled across the city at midnight to return something she could have easily kept, who'd refused a reward because she understood that some things couldn't be bought, who was now working full-time while going to school at night while raising a daughter alone. "You know what I've been thinking about?" he said. "I dropped that wallet on purpose. I was testing you. I wanted to see what you'd do." Elena's expression didn't change. "I figured. You did. You don't seem like the kind of person who's careless with your belongings. And the way you looked at me that night, like you were trying to understand something, it made sense." She paused. "Were you disappointed when I returned it?" "Disappointed? No, the opposite." Marcus set his coffee down. "I've spent the last 3 years believing that people are fundamentally selfish, that given the choice between their own interests and doing the right thing, they'll choose themselves every time. You proved me wrong. And I didn't know what to do with that information. So you gave me a job. I gave you an opportunity. There's a difference." He leaned back in his chair. "Elena, I need you to understand something. What you did that night wasn't normal. It wasn't expected. And it reminded me that I'd become someone I didn't particularly like. Someone who'd let one betrayal turn into a philosophy about everyone. You didn't owe me that reminder, but you gave it to me anyway. So really, I should be thanking you." They talked for another 20 minutes, and it was the first real conversation they'd had since that night at his door. Elena told him about Sophia, about how much easier things had become since starting at Chun Industries, about how it felt to be back in school pursuing something she'd thought was lost forever. Marcus told her about Rachel, about the betrayal that had shaped his last 3 years, about how he'd let that pain turn him into someone suspicious and closed off. And somehow, in that cafeteria, surrounded by the remnants of other people's lunches, they began to build something that wasn't quite friendship yet, but had the potential to become it. Over the next year, that potential developed slowly. They'd run into each other occasionally and talk. Marcus would ask about her classes. Elena would ask about the company. They'd share coffee sometimes or lunch if their schedules aligned. There was never any pressure, never any suggestion that this was leading somewhere it wasn't. They were two people who'd met through unusual circumstances and discovered they enjoyed each other's company. That was all. But it was also, somehow, more than Marcus had experienced in years. Elena was direct in a way that most people in his life weren't. She didn't care about his money or his position. She called him out when he was being cynical or dismissive. She challenged him to be better, and he found himself wanting to rise to that challenge. Elena, for her part, discovered that Marcus was more complicated than she'd initially thought. He was guarded, yes, and sometimes arrogant, but he was also thoughtful and genuinely interested in making things better, not just for his company but for the people who worked there. He'd expanded the continuing education program after seeing how well it worked for her. He'd increased wages for facilities staff. He'd implemented policies that gave workers more flexibility and autonomy. And when she asked him why, he'd said, "Because you can't unsee something once you've seen it. I can't unsee the fact that the system is rigged in favor of people like me at the expense of people like you. The least I can do is try to make it a little less rigged." Sophia met Marcus eventually, though Elena had been careful about that, not wanting to introduce him to her daughter until she was sure of what he represented in her life. They met at a company family event, one of those carefully orchestrated gatherings designed to show that Chun Industries cared about work-life balance. Sophia was 8 years old now, wearing the new glasses that insurance and Elena's better salary had finally made possible, and she was shy at first but warmed up when Marcus asked about the book she was carrying. They talked about reading for 10 minutes, and Elena watched them with something in her chest that felt dangerous, that felt like hope for something she trained herself not to want. After the event, as they were walking to the car, Sophia asked, "Is Mr. Chun your boss?" Sort of, Elena said. "Do you like him?" Elena thought about how to answer that question honestly without revealing things she wasn't ready to admit even to herself. "Yes," she said. "I think I do. He seems nice. And he's not boring like most adults." Elena laughed. That's true. 18 months after Elena had returned the wallet, she finished her nursing degree. The graduation ceremony was small, held in a university auditorium that had seen better days, but it felt monumental to her. She wore the cap and gown that had seemed like an impossible costume 2 years ago. Sophia sat in the audience next to the babysitter, holding a homemade sign that said, "Congratulations, OM," in marker and glitter. And sitting a few rows behind them, though Elena didn't know it until afterward, was Marcus Chun. He waited until most people had left before approaching her. Elena was standing in the lobby, still wearing her cap and gown, talking to Sophia about where they should go to celebrate. When she saw Marcus, she stopped mid-sentence. "You came," she said, and her voice had a quality he'd never heard before, something that sounded like it might be the beginning of tears. "Of course I came. This is a big deal. How did you even know about it? You mentioned it last time we talked." I remembered. He held out a small wrapped package. "This is for you. Congratulations." Elena opened it carefully. Inside was a leather-bound journal with her initials embossed on the cover. On the first page, in Marcus's neat handwriting, was a quote. "Integrity is choosing your thoughts and actions based on values rather than personal gain." Below that, he'd written, "You taught me this. Thank you." Elena looked at him, and there were tears in her eyes now, though she was smiling. "This is too much. It's a journal. It's not too much. You know what I mean." She closed the journal and held it against her chest. "Marcus, I need to tell you something. When I found your wallet that night, I almost kept it. I was so close to keeping it. I needed that money so badly, and I convinced myself I had every reason to take it. I built this whole justification in my head about how you wouldn't even miss it, about how it would solve my problems, about how the universe owed me something. And I was angry at myself for not keeping it. For months afterward, I was angry that I'd chosen to return it instead of making my life easier. Why are you telling me this? Because I want you to know that I'm not some perfect person who always does the right thing without struggle. I'm someone who was desperate and tempted and very nearly made a different choice. The only reason I didn't was because I couldn't live with the person I'd become if I kept it. And what you've done for me since then, this opportunity you've given me, it's made me realize that sometimes the right choice does matter, even when it feels like it doesn't. So thank you, not just for the job or the education support. Thank you for restoring my faith that integrity has value, even in a world that doesn't always reward it. Marcus didn't know what to say. He'd spent months thinking about that night, about the wallet, about what it had meant to him. But he'd never considered what it had cost Elena to make that choice. Never fully understood the weight of the temptation she'd resisted. Hearing her describe it now, hearing the honesty in her voice, made him see her differently. Not as someone who'd performed a simple good deed, but as someone who'd fought a real battle with herself and won. "Can I tell you something?" he said finally. "When Rachel stole from me, when I found out what she'd been doing, it broke something in me. I decided that trust was for fools, that everyone was just waiting for the opportunity to betray you, that the only rational response was to suspect everyone of everything. And I lived like that for 3 years. I built walls. I tested people. I looked for proof of their worst impulses. And I found it, over and over, until my cynicism felt completely justified." He paused, looking at Sophia, who was examining the glitter on her sign with the serious concentration only children could manage. "And then you returned my wallet. And I didn't know what to do with that, because it didn't fit my framework. It challenged everything I'd convinced myself was true. And slowly, over these last 18 months, watching you work and study and raise your daughter and refuse to compromise on your values even when it would be easier, I've realized that I was wrong. Not just about you, about people in general, about the world." "I don't think you were wrong," Elena said quietly. "People do terrible things. People do betray each other. Your ex-wife wasn't an aberration. But neither are the people who choose differently. We exist too. And maybe the real challenge is learning to stay open to both possibilities, to protect yourself without becoming so defended that you can't recognize goodness when you see it." They stood there in that lobby, in the aftermath of a graduation ceremony, with Sophia spinning in circles nearby and other families taking photos and the late afternoon sun coming through the windows in dusty beams. And something shifted between them, something that had been building slowly for 18 months but that neither had acknowledged because it felt too complicated, too risky, too entangled with the circumstances that had brought them together. "Elena," Marcus said, and his voice was different now, softer, more vulnerable. "I'd like to take you to dinner, not as your employer, not as someone who gave you an opportunity, just as someone who'd like to spend more time with you. Would that be all right?" Elena looked at him for a long moment. She thought about all the reasons this could be complicated, all the ways it could go wrong, all the imbalances of power and circumstance that still existed between them even though he'd tried to level the field. But she also thought about the man he'd shown himself to be over these 18 months, about the way he'd respected her boundaries, about the changes she'd seen in him, about how he'd grown from someone bitter and closed off into someone who was learning to trust again. And she thought about the fact that she was happy when she talked to him, that she looked forward to their conversations, that she'd started imagining what it might be like if they were more than whatever they currently were. "Yes," she said, "that would be all right." They went to dinner the following week, to a restaurant that was nice but not intimidating, where they could talk without the weight of circumstance sitting between them. They talked about everything except the wallet. They talked about Sophia, about Marcus's work, about Elena's plans now that she'd finished her degree. They talked about books and movies and the small mundane details of daily life that only matter when you're trying to learn who someone is beneath all their defenses. And at the end of the night, when Marcus walked her to her car, he didn't try to kiss her. He just said, "I'd like to do this again." And Elena said, "So would I." They took it slowly. They had coffee on weekends. They went to museums and parks. Marcus met Sophia properly, spent time with her, learned how to talk to an 8-year-old without condescension. Elena met Marcus's friends, the few he'd maintained relationships with, and saw how he was different with her, softer, more open. They talked about the wallet eventually, about what it had meant, about how it had changed both of them. And they agreed that they were grateful for it, Not because of where it had led, but because it had revealed something true about each of them that they might not have discovered otherwise. 6 months after their first dinner, Marcus asked Elena to move in with him. She said no. She said she needed to maintain her independence, needed to know that she could take care of herself and Sophia on her own terms, needed the relationship to be about choice rather than convenience or necessity. Marcus understood. He didn't push. He just said, "Whenever you're ready, if you're ever ready, the offer stands." A year after that, Elena got her first job as a registered nurse. The salary was good, better than she'd imagined possible when she'd been cleaning offices and staring at that wallet on her cart. She could afford a better apartment now in a safer neighborhood, with 2 bedrooms so Sophia didn't have to share her space. She could afford to save money, to plan for the future, to imagine possibilities that had once seemed fantastical. And through all of it, Marcus was there, not as a savior but as a partner, supporting her choices, celebrating her successes, helping with Sophia when Elena needed it but never overstepping, always respecting the boundaries she'd established. They got married eventually, though it took another year of building trust and demonstrating commitment before Elena felt ready. The wedding was small, held in a garden with just family and close friends. Sophia was the flower girl, wearing a dress she'd picked out herself, beaming with joy at the idea of having Marcus officially in her life. And when Elena and Marcus exchanged vows, when they promised to honor and support each other, there was a weight to those words that came from understanding exactly how fragile trust was and exactly how much work it took to maintain it. At the reception, during the quiet moment between dinner and dancing, Marcus found himself thinking about that night 3 years ago when he dropped his wallet in the Meridian Tower lobby. He thought about how he'd been testing someone he'd never met, looking for proof of his cynicism, expecting to be proven right about humanity's fundamental selfishness. And instead he'd encountered Elena, who'd struggled with temptation but chosen integrity, who'd spent her own time and money to return something that wasn't hers, who'd refused a reward because she understood that some things couldn't be paid for. That choice had cost her nothing tangible but had also, in ways neither of them could have predicted, changed everything. Elena found him standing by the window, looking out at the garden where guests were starting to gather for dancing. She slipped her hand into his. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "The wallet," he said. "I was thinking that I dropped it to test you, to prove something about people. But really, I was testing myself. I was looking for a reason to stay closed off, to justify my cynicism, to avoid the risk of trusting anyone again. And you didn't let me. You made the choice I wasn't looking for, and it forced me to question everything I'd convinced myself was true. Do you regret it? The test? No. But I regret that it was necessary. I regret that I'd become someone who needed to test people at all." He turned to look at her, at this woman who'd been a stranger pushing a cleaning cart and was now his wife, his partner, the person who'd reminded him what integrity looked like when it was practiced instead of just praised. "Thank you for failing my test. Thank you for being someone I couldn't predict or categorize or reduce to my expectations. Thank you for making me better." Elena smiled. "You made yourself better. I just reminded you that it was possible." They went back to the reception, to the dancing and the celebration, to Sophia spinning in circles with the other children, to the life they'd built together that had started with a wallet and a choice and the small, stubborn insistence that goodness mattered even when it cost everything. And as Marcus watched Elena dance with their daughter, as he saw the joy on both their faces, he understood something that had eluded him for years. That trust was not about certainty or control, not about testing and verifying and protecting yourself from disappointment. Trust was about choosing to believe in someone's character even when you had evidence that people could fail you. It was about remaining open to goodness even after you'd experienced betrayal. It was about understanding that integrity was rare but real, and that when you found it, you honored it not by trying to possess or reward it but by living up to it yourself. The story could end there, with the wedding and the happy resolution, with the clear trajectory from test to redemption to love. But life doesn't really work that way, doesn't tie itself up with neat resolutions, doesn't guarantee that choosing the right thing once means you'll always be protected from hardship. 2 years after they married, Elena's mother's medical debt, which had been in collections for years, suddenly came due with interest. The amount was staggering. Elena, who'd finally reached a place of financial stability, found herself facing the possibility of bankruptcy just when she thought she'd escaped the cycle of poverty that had defined her early life. She didn't tell Marcus right away. She sat with the knowledge for a week, trying to figure out how to handle it herself, trying to maintain the independence she'd worked so hard to achieve. But eventually she had to tell him, because they'd built their relationship on honesty, because hiding major problems was a form of betrayal itself, because she'd learned that accepting help wasn't the same as being helpless. When she told him, Marcus's first instinct was to immediately pay off the debt. He could do it easily. It was a number that would barely register in his accounts. But he remembered how Elena had refused his money that first night, remembered the way she'd looked at him when he tried to turn her integrity into a transaction. So instead he said, "What do you want to do?" "I want to handle it myself," Elena said. "But I don't know if I can. The amount is too much. I'd have to take out loans, and with interest it would take me years to pay off, and I'm trying to save for Sophia's college, and She stopped, feeling the tears that she'd been holding back for a week finally break through. "I worked so hard to get out. I did everything right. And it's still not enough." Marcus held her while she cried. And he didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say that wouldn't minimize what she was feeling. The system was broken. She had done everything right. And she was still being punished for circumstances beyond her control. Eventually, when she'd cried herself out, he said, "Let me pay half. You pay the other half however you can manage it, payment plan, loan, whatever works for you. That way you're handling it, you're taking responsibility, but you're not drowning. And it's not charity. It's partnership. It's what people who love each other do." Elena thought about it. She thought about pride and independence and the difference between accepting help and being saved. And she realized that Marcus was right. Partnership meant sharing burdens. It meant recognizing that sometimes you couldn't do everything alone, and that accepting help from someone who loved you wasn't weakness but wisdom. "Okay," she said finally. "Half." They dealt with the debt together. It took Elena another year to pay her half, working extra shifts, carefully managing every dollar. But she did it. And when it was finally paid off, when she made that last payment, she felt something settle in her chest that had been restless her whole life. She'd faced a crisis and she'd survived it without sacrificing her values or her sense of self. She'd accepted help without giving up her agency. She'd learned that strength wasn't about doing everything alone but about knowing when to stand and when to lean. Sophia grew up watching all of this. She saw her mother work multiple jobs while going to school. She saw her mother make the choice to return a wallet when keeping it would have been easier. She saw her mother build a career and a life through sheer determination and integrity. And she learned, without anyone ever explicitly teaching her, that character was something you built through choices, through the small and large decisions that revealed who you were when no one was watching or rewarding you for doing the right thing. When Sophia was 16, she asked Elena about the wallet. They were in the kitchen making dinner, one of those ordinary moments that sometimes become significant without warning. "Mom," Sophia said, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd kept Mr. Chen's wallet? If you'd taken the money?" Elena set down the knife she'd been using to chop vegetables. She thought about that night, about standing in the service elevator counting cash, about the temptation that had felt overwhelming, about the choice that had felt like defeat at the time. "Yes," she said, "I think about it sometimes. What do you think would have happened? I think we would have had an easier couple of months. I could have paid rent. I could have bought you those glasses you needed. I could have eaten something other than pasta and canned sauce." Elena turned to look at her daughter. "But I also think I would have lost something I wouldn't have known how to get back. I would have become someone who justified taking what wasn't mine. And once you cross that line, once you tell yourself that desperate circumstances make theft okay, it becomes easier to cross it again. And again, until you're someone you don't recognize. Do you think it was worth it? Returning it?" Elena thought about everything that had followed from that choice. The job, the education, the financial stability, Marcus, the life they'd built together. But she also knew that none of those rewards had been guaranteed when she'd made the choice. She'd returned the wallet not knowing whether anything good would come from it. She'd done it because it was right, period. The fact that things had worked out was luck or grace or some combination of both. But the choice itself had been worth it independent of the outcome, because it had been a choice about who she wanted to be rather than what she wanted to have. Yes, she said, it was worth it. Not because of what happened after, but because I got to keep looking at myself in the mirror. I got to keep being someone you could be proud of. I got to teach you, by example, that integrity matters even when it costs you. Especially when it costs you. Those things are worth more than $900, Sophia. They're worth more than any amount of money. Sophia nodded slowly, processing this. Then she said, I hope I'm that strong when I'm tested. You will be, Elena said, because you've seen what it looks like. You've seen that it's possible to make the hard choice and survive it. And that's a gift most people don't get. Years passed. Marcus and Elena grew older together. Sophia went to college, became a social worker, dedicated her life to helping people navigate systems that were designed to crush them. Chun Industries continued to grow, but Marcus ran it differently than he had before. He implemented more programs for workers, paid better wages, created pathways for people who'd been locked out of opportunity. And every time someone questioned whether these policies were good for business, he thought about Elena standing in his doorway at midnight, refusing a reward, teaching him that some things mattered more than profit. On their 10th anniversary, Marcus and Elena returned to the Meridian Tower. They stood in the lobby where he dropped the wallet, where she'd stood with her cleaning cart, where both their lives had pivoted on a choice that had seemed small at the time but had turned out to be foundational. The building looked the same. The marble floors still gleamed. The fountain still bubbled in the corner. But they were different people now, transformed by a decade of choosing each other, choosing integrity, choosing to believe that goodness was possible even in a world that often punished it. Do you ever regret it? Marcus asked. The test? The way we started. Elena took his hand. I regret that you felt you needed to test people at all. I regret that someone hurt you so badly that you lost faith in humanity. But do I regret what happened? No, because it led us here. And here is good. Here is good, Marcus agreed. And then, because he'd learned over 10 years of marriage that some moments needed to be marked, that gratitude needed to be expressed even when it felt inadequate, he said, Thank you for being the kind of person who returns wallets. Thank you for teaching me that integrity exists. Thank you for believing in goodness even when you had every reason not to. Elena smiled. Thank you for noticing. Thank you for not letting me disappear back into invisibility after I returned it. Thank you for offering me opportunity instead of charity. Thank you for learning to trust again. They left the building together, walking out into the evening air, into the life they'd built from a wallet and a choice and the stubborn insistence that character mattered. And if you'd asked either of them what the moral of the story was, they might have said something simple. That integrity is its own reward, that goodness creates ripples we can't predict, that one choice can change everything. But they also would have said that none of those things were guaranteed, that returning the wallet could just as easily have led to nothing, that the universe didn't owe anyone a happy ending just because they did the right thing. What made their story matter wasn't the outcome. It was the choice itself. It was Elena standing in that service elevator, tempted and desperate and angry, choosing to be someone she could respect rather than someone who could pay rent. It was Marcus recognizing that he'd been wrong about people and having the courage to change. It was both of them learning that trust was possible after betrayal, that love could grow from unlikely circumstances, that the hard choice was often the one worth making even when it cost everything. Because in the end, that's what integrity is. Not the guarantee of reward, but the commitment to being someone you can live with, someone whose reflection doesn't make you flinch, someone who can tell their daughter stories about choices and mean every word. It's the quiet knowledge that you were tested and you didn't break, that you faced temptation and you chose differently, that when the moment came to reveal who you really were, you revealed someone worthy of respect. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, the world notices. Sometimes it rewards you. Sometimes it gives you more than you dared to hope for. But even when it doesn't, even when the right choice costs you everything and gives you nothing back, you still have the most important thing, you still have yourself. And that, in the end, is what makes us human. Not the absence of temptation, but what we do when we feel it. Not the ease of being good, but the struggle to remain so. Not the guarantee of justice, but the choice to pursue it anyway. That's the story. That's what matters. That's what we tell each other in the hope that someone listening will remember it the next time they're standing in their own version of that service elevator, holding something that doesn't belong to them, deciding who they're going to be. And if even one person makes the harder choice because of it, then the story has done its work. Then the faith has been passed forward. Then the goodness has rippled outward into a world that needs it more than it knows.